Our whole system, unfortunately, has been corrupted and influenced by excess power of big corporations. That's really at the root of the problem.
Your turnaround on the vaccine and your claim that it causes more harm than good.
Yes.
That is obviously a view that is not held by the vast majority of medical opinion or academic opinion.
If you're saying that the vaccines haven't saved lives, that's patently untrue. I worry for the people in America. I worry for my friends and colleagues that I know.
Given what you've said about vaccines, are you going to go to America and say we should ban these mRNA vaccines for COVID?
Absolutely. One of the first things we're going to do is we're going to say, listen, this is the evidence. We need to pause.
So you will stop it?
That is the plan.
Hello and welcome to The Forecast. Aseem Malhotra is a deeply controversial British cardiologist who has just been appointed as Chief Medical Advisor of the Make America Healthy Again campaign group, co-founded by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It makes him one of the US Health Secretary's most influential medical advisors, and that's alarming doctors and academics around the world, because Aseem Malhotra, like RFK Jr., goes against mainstream established opinion on many topics. Most controversially, he opposes the mRNA COVID vaccines, claiming they cause more harm than good, and he wants to end their use in America, even though people are still dying with COVID around the world. In the UK, hundreds of people are dying with COVID every month, yet Malhotra claims the virus is no longer deadly. And that's not all. He supports RFK Jr.'s decision to reinvestigate the totally discredited claims of a link between vaccines and autism, amid alarming levels of vaccine skepticism in America and outbreaks of deadly measles. Now, many people will question whether a vaccine skeptic in the medical profession should be given a platform like this. But it's the platform he's been given in America which makes him powerful. On this forecast, we'll examine his claims and scrutinize them by also talking to Stephen Griffin, Professor of Virology at Leeds University, who's a leading scientist in Britain and believes the claims being made by Malhotra and RFK Jr. are not just wrong, but dangerous. I started by asking Aseem Malhotra what job he'd been given.
So I've been given a role as Chief Medical Advisor to Maha Action, which is a non-profit organization that essentially works at state level to do research, educate, and legislate for the purposes of making America healthy again.
That's what Maha is?
Absolutely.
And what will the role involve?
My role essentially would be to synthesize and analyze data on how to translate the best evidence into policy for reversing chronic disease, because that's obviously the main focus of Maha. All the different levers that need to be pushed, whether it's around legislation on ultra-processed junk food, whether it's on how to improve quality care within the healthcare system itself, because there's a big problem of over-medication, whether it's about also highlighting issues around lack of good quality data or independent data when it comes to doctors giving prescriptions.
So as advisors, or is there power?
No, there is power. We are essentially, in many ways, we are an influence, an educator, and a lobbying group for the purposes of Maha. So we will be speaking to senators, we will be having conversations.
Trying to persuade states to take these measures.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we will have the ear, if you like, of the senators and congressmen.
I mean, it's quite an amazing sort of transition for you, and you've kind of got in with this whole movement in America over the last few years, I suppose, through COVID, isn't it? I mean, how do you know RFK Jr.?
Really good question. So in 2022, and the backstory here, Christian, is I was somebody, and this is really important to get this clarity in the narrative as well, from my perspective and from people to understand this. At the early 2021, I was one of the first people to take 2 doses of the COVID vaccine. I assisted in a vaccine center. I felt I was doing it not because I felt I was at risk, but because it was my duty to protect patients. So for me, there was really no question in my mind there would be an issue. I was a bit skeptical about efficacy, but I didn't think there was going to be harm. Things then evolved. By the summer of 2021, my father, who was a vice president of the BMA, had an unexpected cardiac arrest and died. There was actually an ambulance delay involved in his death. And that was
Kailash Chand. He used to come on the program.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, he was the last survivor in my immediate family. It was obviously devastating for me, but I was shocked, one, because he was a very fit guy. And two, I was also involved, unfortunately, in the circumstances where he had a witness cardiac arrest with two doctors doing CPR. Ambulance was on its way. He should have survived. The ambulance was delayed. So that obviously contributed to his death, but his post-mortem findings didn't make any sense to me. He had severe coronary artery disease. There'd been an acceleration compared to previous scans. Several months later, research was published in one of the prestigious cardiology journals called Circulation. And they basically showed a mechanism of how the COVID vaccine increases inflammation of the heart arteries, which could accelerate heart disease. And it was pretty interesting research. And I thought, this makes sense now. If this is true, we are now going to see increasing death rates from heart disease and heart attacks. I spent months looking into this into detail because I knew I was up against something really big here, a complete change in the narrative, me reluctantly having to change my mind, having felt almost angry to some degree that anyone was questioning the vaccine. So I had to go through that whole psychological process, but the evidence was there. I published in a peer-reviewed journal, independently analyzed. So, I maybe had my own bias because my father died.
We've got to be careful when you talk about prestigious magazines and peer-reviewed journals, because there's lots of different journals.
There is.
There are very established journals like the British Medical Journal.
Yes.
There are offshoots of that. There are things that are owned by it. So, and I know you kind of want people to say, when you use that language, that this is kosher, if you like, for want of a better word.
You're absolutely
But they're
correct.
all disputed as well.
You're absolutely correct. Long story short, for me, it became clear that there was good evidence to say more harm than good from the beginning. We should at least pause. I went on GB News. As soon as I come out of the studio, I get a missed call. I call it back. It was an American number. I'd had no interaction with this person before. It was Robert Kennedy Jr. He'd got my number from someone. He'd hear what I'd done. He said, Aseem, Dr. Malhotra, thank you for your courage. This is Robert Kennedy Jr. Yeah. And after that, we then built a relationship in the sense I went to America, I gave talks.
And you've become big in that whole sort of sphere of that, that sort of MAGA crowd.
Yes.
Tucker Carlson, Russell Brand, not that he's MAGA, but, that whole sort of, that sort of is an alternative media world.
Of course.
Which has really built your profile. It was your turnaround on the vaccine and your claim that it causes more harm than good.
Yes.
That is obviously a view that is not held by the vast majority of medical opinion or academic opinion or the World Health Organization or any of those sort of bodies. You think they're all wrong?
No, I think, listen, I don't think they're all wrong. The people that I've interacted with who share my concerns also can include the new director of the National Institutes of Health, Jay Bhattacharya.
Yes, but who's also a very controversial figure who was behind the Barrington Declaration during COVID and all of that. He's a type.
But he's been proven to be correct. The mainstream...
What I'm saying is that the mainstream opinion
Yes.
doesn't share this view. They say, it's obvious. Look at the deaths from COVID. It is clear that the vaccine did more good than harm. Yes, there was harm. It was in small cases. Yes, there is harm in hearts. Inflammation and all of that, but it's a minority.
Christian, it's a reflection of publicity bias. So what I mean is, and this is why Channel 4 News and what you're doing is so important. What did Malcolm X say? He says Malcolm X said that there's no greater entity than the media. The media can make the innocent look guilty and the guilty look innocent. This also applies to how medical doctors receive information. At the end of 2021, when I had concerns around what was going on with mandates, by that stage, by the way, Christian, there was more enough evidence. You know this. The vaccine wasn't stopping infection or transmission. That was different to the narrative we were told at the beginning.
Well, hang on. What do you mean I know this?
Well, okay. So do you think, from your experience and what you've said, that having the COVID vaccine stopped people getting?
I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to get into the to the view. But the basic fact, is that if you looked at deaths from associated with the vaccine.
Yes.
It was about 119, I think, in 1 year in 2023. And the claim on the lives saved was about 130,000.
Yeah.
Now, so for most people, these facts are pretty incontrovertible.
But they're based upon very, very biased, distorted information. From my perspective, when I'm pushing this, everything for me is about ethics and honesty and transparency. I have no links to the drug industry. I have no conflicts of interest.
What your critics say is that when you say you have no conflict of interest, well, actually, what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years with you is that you've become very big with this group of people, very big in American media. You're very charismatic as a speaker. And, there's a lot of money around that whole area as well. And now you've got power, you've got the job. So actually, you have had something to gain and you've gained it. You've got real power now in America with a man in charge of health who is seen as, you know, a renegade, if you like, for want of a better word. Some people are much stronger than that, and that's what you've got out of this.
Christian, we all have biases, okay? We all have our personal biases. One could argue, if I was playing devil's advocate, Aseem's, you know, become biased because he feels his dad was killed by the vaccine and he's on some sort of vendetta, some mission. That's why I felt it had to go through an independent peer review, where double-blinded, where the peer reviewers didn't know who I was, didn't know, I didn't know who they were, and they agreed that my hypothesis had merit. Okay, so that's one thing. I have lost jobs in the NHS going back 10 years. I actually, in 2013, I published an article in the BMJ about saturated fat and cholesterol and statins, okay? There was a bit of pushback. I actually, no, you asked me about bias. I lost my job. I worked for free in the NHS as a consultant. I then carried on with all this backlash. And I mean, how many people do that? By the way, right now, this role I've been offered...
But that benefits you, it's worth saying. Being an honorary consultant in the NHS gives you a title that says, I am a consultant.
But I have pride. That's what I've worked hard for. And I'm here to put patient duty above anything else. So I have to keep trying to do that.
But it's not entirely selfless, is what I'm saying. You know.
But who is anybody in this world completely selfless? I'm not saying I'm completely selfless. I'm trying to do the best I can for my patients. And I'm also open to discussion and debate. The problem is, if you go to the root of the problem, Krishnan, is our whole system, unfortunately, has been corrupted and influenced by excess power of big corporations. That's really at the root of the problem. And all we're experiencing now is the downstream effects of that. And now we're in the situation where we've got this pandemic of chronic disease, we've got worsening disease, you know, in the UK, we've got life expectancy going down. One would argue, if doctors were actually doing the best to their ability according to the best available evidence, why is population health getting worse?
So, you know, given what you've said about vaccines, you know, are you going to go to America and say, we should ban these mRNA vaccines for COVID, which is still being given?
The rate of harm is so high, and COVID is now no longer deadly, Christian. So even from a rational perspective, there's no better time than now to say, okay.
So what do you want to do? Are you going to go to RFK Jr. and say, you know what, you need to ban that?
I've already had conversations with Robert Kennedy Jr. about this. I think because I've got this independent role with Maha Action, absolutely one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to say, listen, this is the evidence. We need to pause. We need to maybe start getting them suspended in all these states. But also, Christian, what's really important...
So you will stop it?
That is the plan.
Where's the sort of the freedom of people to go ahead with it? Come into that.
As in to
Lots of people believe in these vaccines.
Take it, you mean?
Yes.
Listen, I think the case...
You think they shouldn't have the right to take them?
Listen, it's a very good, everybody should have, that's exactly what we're talking about. We need informed consent. So just to break it down, when a patient comes to me, one of the things I do, why people come and see me privately, is I engage in something which is called shared decision-making. It shouldn't be controversial, but it is.
In terms of the other things you want to do in this new role, I mean, one of your other big skepticisms, you talk about the overprescription of drugs.
Of course.
And one of the drugs you think is massively overprescribed, one of the class of drugs, is statins.
Yes.
Are you going to wage war on the prescription of statins?
No, I'm not going to wage war on prescription of statins. I'm going to wage war on lack of informed consent in their prescription. So there is the highest standards of informed consent, Christian, are what I just told you before, breaking down information, which is available, okay, on making sure patients are not coerced into exaggerating the benefits and exaggerating the safety. So all I'm saying is, what is the best independent evidence telling us?
But most patients just listen to their cardiologist, and the cardiologist says, you know, I think you will benefit from taking this drug because it will reduce cholesterol and that will reduce the chances of you having a heart attack.
Yes.
And most patients just listen to that.
Yes.
So, you know, if you're going to have an intervention that is meaningful, you're going to have to be quite radical about it and go against all the mainstream medical opinion.
Well, it isn't, though, you see. I will cite you 2015, British Medical Journal. I'm the first author, chair of the medical colleges, chair of the GMC. We actually wrote, this is what we should be doing in medicine. It just hasn't been implemented yet. Do you know why? Because
well, that's what I mean. There's one article that you wrote, but I mean...
No, but that was a campaign.
If you ring every cardiologist in London, most of them won't agree with you on statins.
Well, it's not a question of... Yes, that's maybe true, but the question is, it's because we are not conditioned and trained to think in this way. Christian. It's just a question of training and changing the thinking and the approach to medicine. And it has to change from being more paternalistic and more. So, Carl.
But now you're in a position to do something about it in America. So that's so what are you going to do?
Well, listen, I think we just want most important thing, if we want to improve quality of care, we need greater transparency, greater accountability. We need independent evaluation of the scientific evidence. The problem at the moment is we don't have that. I'm a practicing cardiologist where my patients invariably within weeks of just changing their diet alone can send their type 2 diabetes into remission and come off the pills, bring their blood pressure down. So it's simultaneously empowering the profession to...
But that's literally what every GP does. If you go to the GP with pre-diabetes, they don't stick you on drugs. They tell you to change your lifestyle.
They do, but how many of them actually have got outcomes where they show...
Because it's really hard. That's the truth. And that's why we have a lot of drugs.
It is hard. It is hard. You're right. Some people can do it and some people find it difficult. And that brings me to something else. The bigger issue, the broader issue, the base of the problem is actually what determines our health is socially and environmentally determined. So when you talk about the dietary changes, we've got this oversupply of ultra-processed food. Even 70% of the food purchased in hospitals, Christian, is ultra-processed.
Yeah, and this is where you're mining a rich seam, and lots of people agree with you on this.
So it needs to be both. So we need to educate. And absolutely, that needs to be part of the discussion. But the only way the education is going to work effectively is if we actually work on changing the environment. And for example, the ultra-processed food stuff, I've said ultra-processed food is the new tobacco. Yeah. And if we implement changes, I advised Matt Hancock on this during the COVID pandemic. He said, because I was somebody that was able to highlight links between COVID and obesity, and he asked me for advice, and this was reported in the news. And I said, Matt, the single most important thing you can do, in my view, to potentially reverse obesity, the trends of obesity and chronic disease within a few years, is treat the same things that we did for tobacco control, addressing the availability, the acceptability, the affordability, so taxation, banning tobacco advertising, public smoking bans. If you apply the same principles to ultra-processed food, you will see declines within a few years and in terms of chronic disease and improvements in population health.
So is that what you're going to be pushing for in America?
Absolutely.
To tax the big food companies, because they are very powerful
they are,
in America, and they will resist it.
They will resist it, and we expect that to happen. But I think what's happening, we're now at a tipping point.
You try taxing Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Good luck with that one.
Listen, we have to at least put the arguments forward about what we think is going to be best practice. And it's going to need media engagement. It's going to need public engagement. But Christian, people are fed up. There's another big problem with all of this, which really upsets me. Lack of reduction in trust in the medical profession. In the US, and I'm sure the situation, because of the COVID pandemic.
But you're feeding that, because you're telling everybody you can't really trust your doctors.
I'm not feeding that at all. They're doing it themselves. The whole handling of the pandemic has been atrocious.
Well, if you go on Russell Brand's podcast and talk about a lack of trust and all the rest of it, you are feeding into all of those conspiracy theories.
No, it's not. Well, it's not a conspiracy theory. The issue is we shouldn't listen. For me, I don't want to undermine trust in the profession. But if you actually look in America, there was an all-time high trust in the medical profession in April 2020 at 74%. It's now down to 40%.
Yeah. I'm not surprised, because we live in a world in which social media fragments everything. Yeah. There are lots of people like you saying you can't trust what's going on at the moment.
No, Christian, I'm sorry. I think it's legacy media are losing trust, and I think that's one of the
That's also true because of everything that's going on. Lifestyle is the big thing that could make a big difference to people's health outcomes, and that's been your big campaigning issue for many years. And you've just talked about how diets can rapidly change things, in a similar way that drug therapy can. But you also know that the biggest obstacle to that for a lot of people is poverty, housing, income, the ability to afford to buy fresh food rather than ultra-processed food. Yeah. That's the biggest challenge that you're going to face in America, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right, Christian, and I'm glad you raised that. We have to change the narrative. So part of it is lack of knowledge, actually.
But you do know which government you're going to work for, don't you? And what they're going to do.
But actually, to be very precise with you, I'm not actually working for the government. And in many ways,
Well, you are really. I mean, it may be not technically,
indirectly,
but
there's influence there, but it isn't actually, precisely. I'm not actually working for the government. It gives me independence to basically say what I want to say, which I think is best available evidence, which is good in a way. The other thing to mention, Christian, as well, in terms of biases, fine. This particular role for me is unpaid. So because I care so much about this issue, I was willing to actually take an unpaid role for now to try and help them get things moving forward. Hopefully at some point I'll get some remuneration. So I'm not obviously doing it for the money.
But you've got an administration that is looking to make massive cuts to things like housing. Are you going to tell them they're wrong, that will lead to, more chronic disease?
If that's what the evidence tells us, yes, I will absolutely tell
Well, it
them.
absolutely will. It's obvious. You can say that for now, can't you? Because you know that poverty leads to more chronic disease.
Absolutely. But I mean, I think the issue, as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of this particular data on them cuts to housing. But part of that discussion, I've had discussions with senior people in the White House.
I mean, these are all live. They're not necessarily announced, but they're live debates. And the Republican Party also wants to cut Medicaid. A lot of people in that party. I mean, that's going to affect people's chronic illnesses, isn't it?
I agree. And my role is to basically reflect as a doctor, not ideologically, but what does it mean to be healthy?
What will be the effect?
Absolutely.
The other big issue in America and all around the world is the whole question of weight loss drugs, these GLP-1 drugs, as they're called. And you are skeptical about them. Why?
I think this could potentially be another public health disaster. I mean, I've got patients and people I know who have suffered quite serious side effects.
I mean, there's going to be a massive public demand for it. Or there already is, isn't there?
Yeah,
so that's going to be a very unpopular message in America.
There is, but it's being fewer. But at the end of the day, people still want the truth. For me, I still think that almost certainly the best approach is going to be lifestyle. And I fear this is going to end up being a public health disaster, to be honest.
One other issue in America that's very controversial worldwide is the Robert Kennedy view on vaccines and autism. Now, we know what happened in this country with wild claims about the cause of autism and MMR. It was totally discredited. There's no evidence that vaccines cause autism. And Kennedy has reopened this debate and is now having a big inquiry into it. He's going to use you as his sort of medical bolster on that, isn't he?
So I think he's already reached out to independent scientists that he knows to look into this. So I'm not directly involved, first of all, in that particular analysis. But
do you agree it's nonsense?
I think that there is enough of a concern out there. You've got a massive problem with vaccine skepticism now, Christian, which isn't good. I honestly think, and by the way, I think we need to have a conversation that all vaccines are not the same. So the question is, this will hopefully give us some answers about whether or not there is a signal. And let me just break this down.
But he says it's an open inquiry into vaccines. Yeah, but he has said, we are doing this to our children. He clearly believes that vaccines cause autism.
Listen, that was certainly what he said before he got into this role. Of course, now he's in this role. He has different stakeholders he's got to listen to, which I think is a good thing.
Have you talked to him about it?
It's a good thing. I've not talked to him specifically about this, but I've talked to people who are linked to him on this issue. And Christian, I'll be very honest with you. Up until recently, I would have said exactly what you're saying. This vaccine link with autism is nonsense. We've got this whole history of what happened with Andrew Wakefield in the UK and the Lancet, etc. But I've met many, many mothers of children who believe, and listen.
Yes, but that's exploitative and awful, isn't it? I mean...
No, listen to me. Let me finish, Christian, on this, all right? As a doctor, one of the most important principles of being a good doctor is listening to your patient. And there's something called mother's intuition. Now, I'm not saying it's correct, but there is such a groundswell of people
You can't have intuition into whether a vaccine caused autism.
Let me finish. But this is where the inquiry starts. Why don't we try and look at it in a positive way rather than just shutting it down, saying this is, and of course we don't want people to be making false claims, but there's enough of a concern out there, Christian, and at least Robert Kennedy, I think, is doing absolutely the right thing, saying, okay, most of these trials are conducted.
Well, you know what the argument is? The argument is because you cause such vaccine skepticism, uptake falls and people die. And in the meantime, in order to sort of feed this sort of mad world online,
Christian,
you've caused deaths.
You're right, but the vaccine skepticism is there already. We want to improve it.
Yeah.
Right. The question is, what is the best way to improve it? Censorship is not working, and it's not the best way forward. I think Bobby Kennedy's approach is absolutely correct.
Just finally, then you go there with an enormous responsibility on your shoulders, and you know that Look, experts disagree. The one thing people really fear about your side of the argument is that, you've got power now and you've got huge responsibility and that you take that seriously.
Yes, I will. And I think that's absolutely right. For me, I just want to be the best possible doctor I can be. And I take this as a huge duty and responsibility upon myself to do this.
Aseem Malhotra, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk to Professor Stephen Griffin now, who joins us from Leeds. Now, Stephen, you're a virologist and part of the independent SAGE group of scientists who counter misinformation and put public health information into the public domain. I mean, why are people so worried about an appointment like this?
I think it's really important because of the track record that Dr Malhotra and others have got in fairly baselessly scrutinising the COVID vaccines And we're seeing, a depreciation in the uptake of those vaccines year on year, even in the very small number of people who are now actually eligible for those, according to the government. So this is having an effect, and there's a general decrease in sort of people wanting to take up vaccines across the board, not just COVID vaccines. So we think that this is all part and parcel of a growing anti-vaccine movement, of increasing hesitancy. And unfortunately, although they come up with their various reasons for doing so, many of these are due to a misinterpretation of data on the whole.
But that they are now in a position of power.
Yes, well, I mean, obviously that's democracy. Personally, I very much hope that what's happening in the US to NIH, CDC, etc., will not ever happen in this country, because it really is undermining the ability of that country to do good evidence-based science. And
These
many
are government
people...
bodies. Well, let's go through what Aseem Malhotra has been saying and has said in our interview. I mean, right at the beginning, he talks about prestigious publications and papers that have been written. And these are the arguments you always see. That is the evidence. Here's the evidence. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think most scientific knowledge is built on a wide spectrum of so-called prestigious publications. You don't just look at any one paper in its entirety, despite, it may be published in the most reputable journal in the world, but afterwards that may or may not then be cited and carried on to future research. And it's about an accumulation of knowledge based upon multiple studies. And I should say that, when it comes to vaccines, in particular the COVID vaccines, it's not just published articles that you see in peer-reviewed publications that we have to go on. There's masses of publicly available data gathered by governments, pharmaceutical industry, and healthcare systems across the planet now about billions of doses of these vaccines. And we have much more information about these vaccines probably than any other comparable vaccine on the planet.
So when he talks about reading a paper in a prestigious publication that led him to think that, that they were really onto something, why is he wrong about that?
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong, but any scientific study is always a snapshot. It's always set up with controlled conditions and environments, which lead you to be able to answer a specific question that you're set out to do so. So just to say that this particular paper shows this, that, and the other isn't always going to be the right way to go about it. So it's much better to look at multiple studies. Now,
he has his own personal experience of tragedy, and that he lost his father, who was a well-known and respected doctor. But he has latched on to this idea that COVID vaccines cause heart inflammation and cause more harm than good.
Yes, it's very clear that some of the side effects of COVID vaccines and other vaccines, and indeed virus infections, can result in things like myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle, or pericarditis, which is inflammation of the sac around the heart. And both of these can be concerning, okay? For the specific case of the COVID vaccines, however, what Dr. Malhotra is referring to is studies looking at the adverse effects and nothing else, okay? What you need to do is compare the effects of a vaccine, not with not having a vaccine, but with the disease that they are designed to prevent you succumbing to, okay? So yes, it's true that particularly adolescent boys were quite prone to receiving, to getting a myocarditis in the event of their second RNA vaccine. However, that's still a very, very, very small proportion of the number of people that actually had a vaccine, okay? So yes, the risk is raised relative to the background population, but in fact, if you compare it to the risk of developing myocarditis as a result of SARS-CoV-2 infection, the virus that causes COVID, there is a much, much, much greater danger of developing myocarditis from COVID, and indeed that myocarditis being incredibly severe, enough to put you in hospital and intensive care. Whereas the myocarditis from vaccines is generally treatable with anti-inflammatories and some bed rest at worst. So it is important to not just group together these events as a random occurrence, which was done in certain studies that I believe Dr. Malhotra referred to, because you have to associate those studies causatively between the outcomes and the vaccines. And that's not often done in some of these studies, which just look at all the adverse events together. What you have to do, and this is best illustrated, I think, by those reporting systems that we have. Remember, we have huge amounts of surveillance for vaccines after they're rolled out clinically. When people report something that happens close to when they've had a vaccine, they use these systems called the yellow card system in the UK or the VAERS system in America. That then has to be investigated as to see whether it's actually caused by the vaccine or not. And the vast majority of those associative claims are found not to be caused by the vaccine. However, it is true that these things happen. And if you give billions of doses of vaccine, you will get a correspondingly large number of adverse events, even though it actually represents a vanishingly small percentage of people actually having those more serious problems. You know, these are not life-threatening problems in general. And to take your point about the cardiovascular disease as well, there is no sign whatsoever that increases in cardiovascular problems have happened in association with the vaccine rollout. But what there is very clear population level signs, so studies with thousands and thousands of people and millions of people involved, is that there is a huge sign of cardiovascular problems caused by COVID. And that's both sort of your myocardial infarction, your heart attack, inflammation of the heart and what have you. And it's also happening in younger people, which makes sense because these are the younger people contracting the virus and accelerating their disease as a result. So I'm afraid that if you're saying that the vaccines haven't saved lives, that's patently untrue, because if you remember in 2020, 2021, when we had these big waves of infection and there was a correspondingly huge wave of hospitalizations and deaths in the tens of thousands back in 2020, 2021, the vaccines have disconnected that huge prevalence with the severe disease. And that's what the vaccines were originally designed to do. They are there to prevent you becoming severely unwell from COVID. They're not there for anything else at the start. We hope to improve that, but it's important to remember that as we talk about these vaccines.
So Dr. Malhotra says there were 500,000 yellow cards, which makes it sound like a lot of people had adverse effects, and that would be very worrying.
Well, yes, but then you have to compare that to the number of vaccines that have been given out in the UK. So most of us have had at least 2 or 3 vaccines in this country. So that's hundreds of millions already. And then many people have had boosters. So that, and again, what I said about those yellow card events, the vast majority of them are associated, but they're not necessarily caused by the vaccine. So this is something which, it's fantastic to have these reporting systems, but the reason they exist is that like an early warning system to see whether there is a problem. And they do work. They work incredibly well. And the best example of that is the AZ vaccine, which we discovered to cause very, very rare blood clot problems in younger women. But that was only apparent after millions and millions of people had had that vaccine because of the rarity of this problem, this reaction. And remember, a vaccine adverse reaction is exactly that. It's your immune response to the vaccine that's actually causing the problem, not the vaccine itself. So the yellow cards and other surveillance systems across Europe started to spot this. And of course, they stopped giving it to that at-risk group and they changed the way it was rolled out. So, these systems do work. The reason that there hasn't been a response associated with cardiovascular disease in response to these yellow cards is not because people are ignoring them, it's because they weren't actually attributable to the vaccine.
Now, the whole vaccine skeptic movement claim the data is tainted, it's corrupt, it lacks transparency. How much of that has any merit?
Well, I think it really depends on what data they're referring to. So you find quite a lot of the times that they are, as we said just before, focusing on one aspect of a paper that they find supports their narrative a lot of the time. We have to also remember that the initial studies were small, they got bigger, and now we have a vast wealth of data from population, from the entire planet having received, obviously there's differences in vaccine availability, but the entire planet has received multiple doses of these vaccines. Billions of doses have been given. There is a vast amount of information out there. Now, that's not just the drugs companies which conducted the initial trials. And yes, they have to do those trials because they're also the only people that are prepared to invest the money to generate these medicines. It's the way our world works. If we want to change that, governments have to step up and invest in developing medicines, which I think would be an excellent thing. But the drugs companies, you can't have your cake and eat it. You either ask the drug companies to make the medicines and conduct the trials, and so therefore collect the data, or you don't have medicines. So I'm not sure what the solution is for that, other than governments to do it, which I would love to see for therapeutics as well as vaccines. But the point is that these drug companies have to achieve a certain standard of data to get these past the regulators. They don't always succeed. Something about 20% of applications to the FDA don't get approved. So it's not a rigged system, and these drug companies invest billions and billions of dollars and pounds in doing this. So unless we're prepared to do something different, we can't ever change that. So you're stuck in that scenario. So you can make up conspiracies about how the pharmaceutical companies are biased or what have you, and of course they want to get a return on their product. Of course they are. But if you entrust businesses to do that, you have to expect them to have a business-like output. So that's the simplicity of it.
I mean, he and they also say, well, the thing about other experts and scientists like you is that you won't bite the hand that feeds you, and that these drug companies feed your research.
Well, I did have a very small grant from Pfizer once, about 15 years ago. I think it was for £10,000 to get a project started. I also consulted for them once on their Paxlovid, their drug, the trials they were doing from that. But again, where else would scientists get funding from? I think there are alternative routes for funding in other countries, so philanthropy, for example. But if you want to talk about conflicts of interest, then maybe that's an even harder argument to have. So I think that most scientists obtain their funding from governments, but the funding agencies, they have legal declarations that they don't have any say in the research that's produced as a result of that funding. That's part of the contract you sign when you're awarded a grant from government. It's also true for pharmaceutical companies.
How frustrating is it for you to see these arguments resurface?
Well, they've been horribly prevalent, actually. But I think it's been recently emboldened by what happened in America recently. But social media it's full of these sorts of stories of skeptics. I imagine that I will probably receive blowback from doing this podcast on my Twitter/X account and on Blue Sky because people get very angry about it. And I think it really is an important thing to deal with. And I don't think it's something that should be dealt with at the sort of public level. It needs to be from the top. These people need to provide guidance, and because the power of this anti-vaccine narrative is immense. I think we're going to talk about measles soon, but it struck me that the very, very sad case of one of the children who died in Texas, who hadn't been vaccinated by the parents. There was an interview with the parents after the poor child had died, and they actually said it was the right thing to do not to vaccinate him, despite the loss of a child. Those parents are as much victims of this sort of narrative as almost as that, but obviously not the same as the child dying. But, the whole problem with this is that this is undermining decades of public health standards that we've built up through childhood vaccination schemes and, yes, in an emergency to quell a pandemic. And this is having a huge knock-on effect across the board.
Now, he wants to get these vaccines banned in America. And he says that now is the time because COVID's no longer deadly. There are people dying of COVID still, but I suppose it's correct that it's not deadly on the same scale as it was.
Right. Again, this depends on whether you're thinking about populations or if you're thinking about individuals. Okay, so on an individual basis, if you've been vaccinated, a chance of you developing a COVID infection and then dying is much, much smaller now than it was in 2020, 2021. Okay, that much is abundantly clear. But the problem is that because we are all distinct individuals, we respond to vaccines differently. So this virus hasn't lost its teeth. What makes us able to not have these problems that we had at the beginning of the pandemic is the fact that we've been immunized, the fact that we have antivirals, and the fact that we understand how to clinically manage this disease much better with anti-inflammatory treatment as well for severe disease. So if you don't use those tools, if you stop vaccinating people, you are then at increased risk. And I should also mention that the first exposure to a virus is always the most dangerous. And so for children who are not being vaccinated and who are young, below 5 years old, there's actually quite a significant risk of them having problems with COVID and indeed other respiratory viruses.
Now, the other big issue that RFK Jr. has reopened is measles and vaccination. And he has resurfaced this old theory of a link between vaccines and autism, which was totally debunked. And it was shown that there was no link between vaccines and autism. And yet RFK Jr. is having a new investigation into it. Now, Dr. Malhotra says, well, there's so much skepticism out there. It's a good thing to look into these things and tell people definitively.
Right. Well, I think you're right. I think it's already been definitively shown that that's not the case. And my view of that is that you're, on the one hand, saying, look, we're being open and honest and investigating this. But I also think that if you're reinvestigating something that's already been settled and settled by very large studies, then you're actually casting doubt upon those previous studies, for one. And I also think that public opinion will start to say, well, there's no smoke without fire. And I think that hesitancy around the MMR vaccine has been steadily growing since the study you mentioned by Andrew Wakefield was published in The Lancet all those years ago. And it hasn't stopped. And we've seen a depreciation of uptake of childhood vaccines as a result of that study. And it's actually a common facet of disinformation and misinformation, actually. You know, they can plant those seeds out there. It takes so much more work to debunk it and disprove it than it does to just start that rumor going.
So the investigation itself is damaging?
Yeah, I would say so, because you're saying no smoke without fire. This is veneer of respectability and saying, look, we're being open about this. But if you were satisfied with those previous studies, and actually a lot is known about various genetic causes of autism, although it's an incredibly complicated process, you know, it's not triggered by vaccination, certainly not the MMR vaccines.
I mean, this is all justified by what they say is a fall in trust in the medical profession. Do you think that's real, and what do you think is causing it?
I'd say there's an element of chicken and egg there. So I think hesitancy and mistrust has grown dramatically since 2020, and people blame social media and they blame various conspiracies and all the rest of it. And I do think social media has a role, but I also think that there's a lot of very good information out there. I think we could do more to educate people. So, you know, and there are also some policy problems that can cause issues as well. So, for example, when we cut our childhood COVID vaccine program in the UK, that was celebrated by anti-vaccine movements in America. You know, so that this is a sign, look, they must know that this is causing damage. They twist things to not mean what they're actually meant to be. So it's really important that we educate people to the value of these things.
But overall, how worried are you that people who hold these views are now in power in America?
Incredibly worried. Yeah, and also worried that the sort of narrative that we're seeing there will spread. And I think they'll probably get away with it for a few years because it won't be evident that what they do damages things for a few years. But it's already having tremendous effects on research infrastructure, on public health. But at the same time, they're dismantling various systems. They're also not now monitoring them. So the problem kind of goes away until it really does rear its ugly head, like in the measles outbreak. So yeah, I find it completely against the spirit of public health. I worry for the people in America. I worry for my friends and colleagues that I know working in America in research and clinically. I worry as well at the sort of vilification, so against, you know, directed against people like Tony Fauci, etc., Peter Hotez. Peter Hotez, who, by the way, has developed a COVID vaccine for free, independent of pharmaceutical companies, and given it to tens of thousands of people. It's not how science should be. It's a politically motivated change in the way that people are doing things, and it's being justified by this big sort of veneer of trying to do good. And, you know, I don't doubt that there are improvements people could address in terms of lifestyle, both here and in America. But the root cause of most of these issues, and there have been really good, careful studies on this, is the poverty gap and impoverished regions in different countries, and the difference between rich and poor and different social groups. Those are the root causes of the societal issues that we have in terms of health. And until they address those sorts of issues, I don't think that some of the things that they're proposing will have any benefit whatsoever, I'm afraid.
Stephen Griffin, thank you very much. And that's it for this edition of The Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.